So, firstly, Anthony will look at the impact of recent energy and food price increases on the overall Irish inflation rate and outline some work underway on the Consumer Price Index. Passing over to Anthony.
Thanks very much, Rachel. So, I'm just going to give a quick insight into some inflation topics, let's say, focusing around kind of energy and food. So just a quick background of the consumer prices section in the CSO. We produced the Consumer Price Index and the Harmonised Index of Consumer Prices. We also publish a flash estimate of Harmonised Index of Consumer Prices. And we also produce a constant tax series for the Harmonised Index of Consumer Prices, which we send to Eurostat. So just a bit of recent history around the Consumer Price Index. So again, we can all kind of remember inflation peaking at that 9.2% in October 2022. We saw a gradual decrease all the way down to 0.7 in September of 2024. And we've seen it increase slightly since then, coming to around inflation rate around 2.2% in 2025. The most recent results we published were May 2026. We saw inflation at 3.6%. This was driven primarily by energy prices, which we saw contribute around a third of the overall inflation rate. Next Thursday, July 9th, we'll be publishing the June 2026 figures. So recently we created a new publication focusing on specific aspects of the CPI. It's called our CPI Insight Series. And what this allowed was for a more detailed analysis of recent trends and timely response to inflationary shocks. So as I mentioned, the one we published in March 2026 looked at petrol, diesel and home heating oil. We felt this was necessary due to the daily price movements that we were seeing. It was kind of a crazy time in terms of price movement. So we felt that it gave us a chance to look at in more detail at the price levels and the contribution of these items to overall inflation. It also gave us a chance to detail the methodology for the home heating oil, the petrol and the diesel, how we collect prices. As I say, we can't publish that in our regular CPI, so it was a good chance to kind of delve down into the detail. And then it also helped to explain why inflation wasn't impacted as much as it was in 2022. What we saw, it gave us a chance, for example, to explain that our prices for petrol and diesel were collected before the highest points of the prices, as they price movements were almost daily. And also then, when it came to April, we saw that our prices were collected before any government measures came in. So we were you have to kind of be able to try and explain how this is happening. So just looking at the price index for fuels and home heating oil, basically the price index is, in simple terms, it shows the price levels compared to a point in time. So this is December 2023. And what we see is that in March 2026, we saw that prices for home heating oil reached their highest price level that we'd seen since we've started publishing detailed sub-indices in 1996. This is higher than it was in 2022 after the invasion of Ukraine. But again, just looking at price levels doesn't tell the full story, and this is why it was important for us to be able to publish this insight series. Because when you then take a look at the 12-month percentage changes for the fuels and home heating oil, you see that actually, due to the low price levels that we saw in 2021, the rate of change was almost 126% year on year back in March 2022, compared to around 65% in March 2026. So to say, even though the price levels for the home heating oil were much higher, and for petrol and diesel, you're seeing that actually the percentage change year on year, which is what factors into the overall inflation rate, wasn't as high as it was back in 2022. And then following on from that, we can kind of look at the contributions of those items, so the fuel and the home heating oil, to the overall CPI. And again, you see here the bar chart show the combined impact on contribution of those three items to the overall inflation rate, which is the blue line. And what we see again is that 2026, while there was that spike due to the conflict in the Middle East, we see that it didn't impact inflation as much as the invasion in Ukraine did in 2022. And again, that's just simply because of the low price levels that we saw in 2021 prior to that massive increase into 2022. So again, it's important that it's important that we're able to kind of produce this new report or this new insight series that basically just allows us to delve into a bit more detail and give the full story as to what's going on. You're not just relying on kind of the recent trends. You can delve into a bit further and get a bit more information. So looking then at a few of the inflation trends that we've seen, a key focus of household and experts user has been kind of the volatility around energy and food prices due to the global factors that have kind of come into play in the last couple of years. We've seen energy price shocks, as I mentioned, in 2022, and then again recently in 2026. The increase in the cost of food, which is a bit more gradual, but has continued over time. And then looking again at kind of service prices, especially in the restaurant sector, and kind of how those have impacted on inflation. So just taking a look at the energy prices, it's kind of that graph that I showed earlier, but we've also included the electricity and natural gas. And what you can see here is that the energy prices, what you see is there's a lag in the electricity and natural gas from the initial kind of shock around the oil-based energy prices. So again, in March 2022, you see the impact of the invasion into Ukraine and kind of the sharp increase in the price of petrol, diesel and home heating oil. But then later in the year, September, October time, you see kind of the feed-in of the electricity and natural gas prices. And again, then following on to 2026, you see that initial shock from March 2022 of the oil-based energy prices, and we haven't yet seen the electricity and natural gas come through into the CPI. However, I think it's common knowledge that I think electricity companies and gas companies are flagging that there will be price increases later in the year. So we'll probably see those kind of come through into the CPI. Then just taking a look at the food prices on top, kind of trended alongside the energy prices. Again, you see that shock at the start of 2022, but it takes a while for that to impact into the food sector. You don't really see food prices start to increase until the summer of 2022, and then there's just a constant gradual increase kind of all the way from late 22 until current time, where it's kind of increased from that index price of 80 all the way up to just over 100 now. And again, you see at the end of 2026 that shock of the energy prices. But then when we look at the restaurants, the cafes and food overlaid on top of that, again, you can see that the yellow line, which is the restaurants, cafes and fast food, that trends very similarly to the food rather than to the energy prices. So it shows that it's the food that might be impacting more on kind of the cost of eating out and getting your coffees in takeaways and stuff like that, rather than the energy prices as such. And why are we looking at the food and the kind of the food out? Well, I suppose when you look at the energy, we all kind of see energy and we see the shocks that come in and we see the kind of the price increases firsthand. But the weights in the CPI basket, so this is kind of the importance to the overall inflation rate. You see that energy total is about 8.7%, whereas food is around 11%. Eating out in restaurants, cafes and fast food, that's close to 15% of the CPI basket. And then you have kind of the bar and pubs come in at about 3.6%. So it does show that, you know, while energy is important, the food and the eating out, it's really, really a key factor of the consumer price index. So I suppose, what is driving inflation? We see the food price increases. They kind of have this delay from the global events. You don't see that instantaneous increase in prices. It's more gradual. It comes in after a bit of a delay, based on what we saw in 2022. You see then that food prices, they tend to have a knock-on effect into the cost of eating out. And as I say, the food that you buy in the supermarkets and the food that you buy out in restaurants, or the drinks that you buy out in restaurants, they have a very high importance in the CPI basket. And I think it's kind of underestimated when people talk about inflation, just the impact that kind of eating food out does have. I often kind of say that if you buy a jar of coffee for €6 or €7, you're getting a lot of cups of coffee out of that jar, whereas €6 or €7 might not get you 2 cups of coffee out these days. So you kind of have to factor that in. And then I suppose it's not to say energy isn't important. It's still a very important factor in the overall CPI, coming in just around close to 10%, but the prices are much more volatile. You see those price shocks a lot sharper, and they come in and you kind of, and see the impact almost instantaneously. So then, just to give a bit of background on some of the upcoming developments in the CPI and HICP. So scanner data, currently we have 4 markets which provide us with scanner data for grocery prices. So what scanner data is it's all the items that pass through the till on a weekly basis. The supermarkets send the data directly to us at an aggregated level. So currently we're using 2 in production, and we have a project underway to incorporate the other 2 into the CPI by January 2027. So the impact on the CPI, so what having the scanner data allows us to do is have a larger sample of products and prices in the CPI. We are currently able to work out unit values, so we're able to work out the average cost of an item. So that might impact the people who have the loyalty cards for certain supermarkets or 3 for 2 offers and stuff like that. If people aren't getting the full value, we can still see what the average consumer is paying and the cost of that to them. It also gives us the potential to improve the basket of goods and services and the representativeness of that basket. Again, we can kind of look at the supermarket scanner data directly and be able to kind of choose what we think should be added in and what shouldn't. And then it gives us the potential to update it every year rather than kind of the every 5 years that we currently do. Again, that would be mainly around the food and personal goods, but it would allow us to improve the representativeness of that basket. So finally, just a bit of background on the estimated inflation by household characteristic. We last published this in September 2023, but we currently have a project underway to reintroduce the estimated inflation by household characteristic frontier series. I think we'll be looking to publish that in the coming months. So just then, as part of that, we're a member of a Eurostat task force, which is currently looking at improving the methodology of the EIHC. So again, we're kind of looking at maybe improving the methodology, looking at different baskets for different household types. A lower income household wouldn't have the same purchases as a higher income household. So looking at maybe using different items. Taking a look at cheapflation. So this is the impact of inflation on budget items rather than branded items. Again, you'd see price rises on budget items would have more impact than, say, a small increase on branded items. And then kind of how households change from using branded to non-branded items. And again, this is where some of the scanner data might become in use and really help us kind of get a good idea into kind of how consumer habits are changing and are people moving to more budget items, more non-branded items. So thanks very much.
Next presentation. So now Jack will present a comparison of the economies of Ireland and Northern Ireland, focusing on the Dublin-Belfast Economic Corridor. And this is a recent CSO release on our website. So I'll hand over to Jack.
Thanks, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. Jack O'Connell is my name. I'm a graduate statistician in national accounts, and I'm going to be talking you through today a statistical release we published a few weeks ago comparing the economies of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So in the programme for government, there's a commitment to deliver a series of north-south statistical releases comparing the two jurisdictions in terms of social and economic measures. And so this statistical release represents the CSO's contribution to that commitment. This is following on from a joint census publication that the CSO published in collaboration with the Northern Ireland Statistical Research Agency. For this particular release, we got a lot of input from NISRA as well as the Office of the Taoiseachs. And I just want to start with this infographic. So this represents kind of the 4 themes that I want to talk about today. The first theme there is that disposable income per person is higher in Ireland than Northern Ireland, and Ireland concentrates a much higher proportion of its compensation of employees in sectors that tend to have higher wages. The second theme there is that the Irish economy is generally larger than the Northern Irish economy, and Ireland similarly concentrates a much higher proportion of its gross value added in sectors that have higher wages and higher profits. The third theme there is following on from that is that Northern Ireland is much more heavily reliant on social benefits per person to support incomes. And in Northern Ireland, a much higher share of compensation of employees and gross value added is concentrated in sectors like the public, administration, education and health sector. And then the fourth theme there is that median house prices are considerably higher in Ireland and housing affordability is much lower for the Irish regions. So The release is going to be comparing the two jurisdictions at a few different levels of granularity. So the NUT system is the nomenclature of territorial units for statistics. So this is a geographic subdivision of the a geographic nomenclature rather, subdividing the economic region of the European Union into three levels of granularity. So there's the NUTS 1 level, which is the national level, and then there's the NUTS 2 and NUTS 3 level. So Ireland as a whole is one NUTS 1 region, and then that can be broken down into the northern and western, southern, eastern and midland regions. That can be broken down further then into 8 NUTS 3 regions, so the border, west, midwest, southeast, southwest, Dublin, the Mid-East and the Midlands. So in this release we compare Ireland against Northern Ireland as a whole, and we also compare Northern Ireland to the 3 NUTS 2 regions and the 8 NUTS 3 regions within Ireland. There are also 11 local government districts in Northern Ireland, and the project has a particular chapter presenting data on the Dublin-Belfast Economic Corridor, and I'll say a bit more about that later on. So most of the figures in this release are presented in terms of purchasing power standard amounts. So we use the purchasing power parity rates to convert euros and pound sterling amounts into this hypothetical currency, purchasing power standard, or PPS. So one PPS can theoretically buy the same amount of goods and services in every economy, and so it allows for fair comparisons of things like GDP or disposable income. So we use this PPS to account for differences in currency and purchasing power between the two regions. So I mentioned that the first theme is that disposable income is higher in Ireland than Northern Ireland. So this is a time series of gross disposable household income per capita. We have Northern Ireland in yellow and the 3 NUTS 2 regions in Ireland, so the Eastern Midland in dark blue, we've Northern and Western in turquoise, and the Southern region in light blue. So we can see here that this metric, disposable household income, is highest in the Eastern, Midland and Southern regions. Disposable household income is what people generally have money left over to spend after social insurance contributions and current taxes on income have been deduced. So during this period, the Eastern and Midland region had the highest increase in that metric, while Northern Ireland had the lowest increase. The other side of that then is that Northern Ireland is much more heavily reliant on social benefits per capita to support incomes. So with the social benefits per capita, we take the social benefits and we divide it by the population of the local authorities or local government districts in Northern Ireland. So the map here shows that the social benefits per capita were lowest in Dublin, Meath and Kildare, while they're highest in Ards and North Down, Carlow and Louth. It's worth noting there that Ards and North Down is demographically the oldest local government district on the island, and so the higher social benefits in that region might reflect a higher proportion of people drawing the state pension. As well as that, Ireland and Northern Ireland have disparate social welfare systems, so any comparison will not be on a like-for-like basis, and as well as that, the differences in social benefits between the two regions are made slightly more stark by the conversion to PPS rates. So this is the percentage of compensation of employees by economic activity for Northern Ireland as a whole, as well as Ireland as a whole, and we are comparing that against the NUTS 2 regions. So compensation of employees is wages and salaries, benefits in kind, and employers' social contributions. So I just want to focus in on the information and communication sector in blue there. So in the Eastern and Midland region, the COE share of that sector was 3 times that of Northern Ireland as a whole. And then for the financial and insurance activities sector, so in green there, the share of that sector in the Eastern and Midland region was twice that of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland then had the second highest shares of the public administration, education and health sectors as well as the distribution, transport, hotels and restaurants sector. For comparison then, the Northern and Western region in Ireland had the 2 highest COE shares of those 2 sectors. So that was the first theme, that disposable income is higher in Ireland. As well as that, the Irish economy is larger than the Northern Irish economy. So here we have gross value added in current basic prices per capita by region. So the Northern Ireland there is in green, and that's compared against the NUTS 2 regions for Ireland. We can see here that the Eastern and Midland and Southern regions generally had the highest GVA per capita during this period. Northern Ireland had the lowest. So this is the same graph, we just take out the Eastern, Midland and Southern regions, and we can see that Northern Ireland is broadly comparable to the Northern and Western region in Ireland up until around 2015, when the Northern and Western region starts to diverge. By 2023, GVA per capita in the Northern and Western region was 38% higher than Northern Ireland. So if we bring back in the Eastern and Midland regions, then the Eastern Midland and the Southern region, we can see there's a jump in gross value added per capita in the Southern region around 2015. So this probably reflects the presence of multinational corporations in that region. And so it might be thought that because there is so much multinational activity in the Irish economy that the differences between the two regions might be less stark if we take out those effects. Well, what this graph shows is that even if we account for globalisation, the Irish economy is still larger than that of Northern Ireland. So in this time series, we have Irish GDP per capita, Irish GNI star per capita, and Northern Irish GDP per capita. So GNI star is a measure of economic activity that accounts for globalisation by subtracting the depreciation on intellectual property, the depreciation on leased aircraft, and the net factor incomes of the redomiciled PLCs. And so we can see, so Northern Ireland is in yellow, Irish GNI star per capita is in green, so the Irish economy is still larger than Northern Ireland, even if we take out those globalisation effects. As well as that, the Irish economy diverged from that of Northern Ireland between 2013 and 2023. So 2013, Irish modified GNI or GNI star per capita was 18% higher than Northern Irish GDP. That gap had increased to 49% by 2023. After 2020 then, the Irish economy grew at a faster rate than the Northern Irish economy. So between 2020 and 2023, Irish GNI star had increased by 42%, and that's compared against Northern Ireland's 27%. So similarly to SUI then, we can see that Ireland concentrates a much higher share of its gross value added in sectors that tend to have higher wages and higher profits. So here again, we're comparing Ireland as a whole and Northern Ireland as a whole with the NUTS 3 regions in Ireland. So the information and communication sector is there in green. The GVA share of that sector was 7 times higher in Ireland than Northern Ireland, while the GVA share of that sector in Dublin was 10 times that of Northern Ireland as a whole. Northern Ireland then had the largest share of its GVA in the public administration, education and health sector. So that was 24.1%, which was twice that of Ireland as a whole. We can also compare the two economies in terms of labour productivity. So labour productivity measures output per hour worked. Here we measure output using gross value added in chain-linked volumes linked to 2022. So in a chain-linked series, like say chain-linked GDP, we value goods and services produced in a particular year using the prices of a base year. And so that removes the effect of prices or value effect, so that any increases in output reflect a pure increase in the quantity of goods and services produced. And that gives us a volume effect, which is usually a much more meaningful comparison. So we have the labour productivity of the two total economies. So Ireland is in yellow. You can see that both economies recorded increases in labour productivity in 2020, although that probably reflects a fall in hours worked as opposed to an increase in gross value added. I mentioned previously that Irish GDP and GNI star were increasing from 2015 onwards. So that implies that the increases in labour productivity are driven by output, and as well as that, labour productivity is not robust to the effects of globalisation. So we can bring in the Irish foreign and domestic sectors there. So the Irish domestic sector in dark blue and the Irish foreign sector in green. The foreign sector is defined as those sectors where more than 85% of the turnover is occurring to foreign multinationals. And we can see here that there is a significant disparity between the labour productivity of the Irish foreign and domestic sector, but even if we account for that, the Irish domestic sector still had higher labour productivity than Northern Ireland as a whole. So the comparisons so far have been at NUTS 2 and NUTS 3, at the NUTS 2 and NUTS 3 levels. I want to now focus in on the Dublin-Belfast corridor. So that's the geographic area connecting the two capital cities. In Ireland, the local authorities that make up the corridor are Dublin City, South Dublin, Dún Laoghaire, Rathdown, Fingal, Louth and Meath. Then in Northern Ireland, the local government districts are Newry, Morning Down, Armagh City, Banbridge and Craigavon, Lisburn and Castlereagh and Belfast. So this is year-on-year GVA growth for the regions in the corridor, and that's telling us a similar picture to the comparisons at the NUTS 2 and NUTS 3 levels. So GVA growth was highest in the Irish regions of the corridor. So the Mid-East includes Louth and Meath that had the highest year-on-year growth, followed by Dublin, while Armagh City, Banbridge and Craigavon had the lowest year-on-year growth in GVA. We also have data for employment across the corridor. The two capital cities have the highest shares of the services sector in yellow and the two lowest shares of construction in blue. The other side of that then is that Newry, Morning Down, which had the lowest employment in 2024, had the lowest shares of its employment in the services sector and the highest share in construction. And 2024 was the most recent year for which we had all the data for the regions in the corridor. So we also have data on median house prices for the regions in the corridor. You can see, so the blue line is Dún Laoghaire, Rathdown, so that had the highest median house prices for the local authorities that make up the corridor. Meath then, which is in green, was broadly similar to Lisburn and Castlereagh, which is in grey. However, Meath diverges significantly from that region to the point where in 2024, Meath had the fourth highest median house prices in the corridor. Similarly, Louth was among the lower house prices in 2014. That had increased to the fifth highest by 2024. For comparison then, the regions in Northern Ireland had lower median house prices. So you can see there Belfast in turquoise had the lowest line during the period. We can use the median house prices to calculate a price earnings ratio. So this is a basic metric of affordability because it expresses median house prices as a multiple of median gross annual earnings. And both these variables are presented in euros. So this is a time series then of that ratio for the corridor regions. You can see Dublin there in yellow is the least affordable county in the corridor. So in 2014, median house prices were 7.7 times the median gross annual earnings in Dublin. By 2024, that had increased to 9.6. So similarly, Louth in 2024 had a ratio of 4, and that had almost doubled to 7.8 in 2024. For comparison, you can see the lines representing the Northern Irish regions are a lot flatter. So that's telling us that median house prices are rising more in line with median gross annual earnings for the Northern Irish regions. So Belfast, for example, had a ratio of 4.4 in 2014, and that had only increased to 5.1 by 2024. And then so my last slide is this is a comparison of the highest level of educational attainment for the corridor regions. So the two educational systems have been aligned into 5 categories. So there's more information about that in the background notes of the publication. We just present the main 3 ones here. So the higher professional qualification was highest in Fingal, followed by Dublin City and then Meath. And this and that level of qualifications was lowest in Armagh City, Banbridge and Craigavon. So to sum up then, the disposable income per capita is higher in the Irish regions than the Northern Irish regions. Ireland also contributes a much higher proportion of its compensation of employees in sectors that have higher wages. The Irish economy is also larger than the Northern Irish economy by a few different measures, even if we account for the effects of globalisation. And gross value added in Ireland is more highly concentrated in high profit sectors like information and communication. The labour productivity of the Irish economy is also higher than that of Northern Ireland, although there are significant disparities between the productivity of the foreign and domestic sectors in Ireland. And then Northern Ireland is much more heavily reliant on the state to support disposable incomes. So social benefits per capita are higher in Northern Ireland, and a much higher share of COE and gross value added is concentrated in the public administration, education and health sector. And then the last theme there is that median house prices are considerably higher for the Irish regions of the Dublin-Belfast corridor, and housing affordability was also lower for those regions. So that's my email there on the screen. I'm happy to take any inquiries, but thanks very much for listening, and I'll happy to field any questions.
So I think that's that for now. Thanks very much, Jack. So then moving on, and finally, infrastructure plays a key role in the economy and in society. And Brian is going to present on some work to measure the investment in infrastructure in Ireland.
Thanks, Rachel, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about the work we've been doing recently to measure investment in infrastructure, and also to talk about our plans for developing a comprehensive set of infrastructure accounts of the Irish economy. Because infrastructure in the economy is made up of the stock of existing infrastructure assets plus investment in new assets, less the depreciation or the usage in those assets. So I'm mainly going to focus on the work we've been doing on measuring the investment in infrastructure, in particular the building and construction component of infrastructure. But I'll talk more about what infrastructure accounts are first. So the best way to look at what infrastructure accounts are is to see what some of the questions are that they could answer. And they can help answer questions like, what is the total value of our national infrastructure assets? Or how has the stock of infrastructure changed over time? And also things like, is investment in infrastructure keeping pace with usage and wear and tear? So are we adding to the net capital stock of the economy, or are we just maintaining our existing stock? And then we can look at what proportion of national wealth is held in infrastructure when we take the total sum of our non-financial assets, like our capital stock and infrastructure, and sum it with financial assets. And then we can also look at things like, what is the remaining service life of key infrastructure assets? Now, we've a while to go before we can answer all of these questions, but I'll take you through what we've done so far. So what we've done is we've consulted with government departments, and we have tendered for and obtained new private data services. So we have detailed analysis now of individual building projects that pass through the planning system, from planning, commencement, and through to completion. So that's helping us with providing more detail on these new investments in building and construction assets. So it's worth noting here that there is other things in infrastructure assets, such as machinery and equipment, but we haven't been able to dig into them in too great detail as of yet. And we're also, I'm sorry, that flicked a slide too far. We're also engaging with the OECD in an informal expert group on infrastructure to develop a common international definition and classification of infrastructure within the system of national accounts. And I'll go into more detail on these in the next slide. And what we've also done this morning is we've published an information note alongside the annual national accounts, breaking down building and construction investment in infrastructure and non-residential construction. And I'll take you through that table in later. So to develop a definition of infrastructure, it can seem obvious to most of us what infrastructure is if we've been on the M50 this morning, or if we got a train or Lewis this morning. But when you dig into the weeds of it, there is still edge cases still being discussed at the OECD level. So it's important to say that infrastructure isn't just the net capital stock of the economy. It's not the sum of all fixed assets in the economy. We publish that release in September every year. So we've fed into these discussions at the OECD level, and the definition is evolving based on the characteristics that would describe infrastructure. And the most important one is that infrastructure would provide a fundamental support functions to satisfy basic economic and societal needs. So an example here to think about is petrol stations and supermarkets. We've seen the impact when both would have shortages in the last number of years. But supermarkets would provide a really important societal need, but maybe not the important economic need that petrol stations would. So currently, as the definition is that supermarkets are excluded from infrastructure and petrol stations are included. Infrastructure also should be restricted to hard and produced assets. So for the most part, it excludes things like intellectual property, and it would include improvements to land such as flood defences, but it wouldn't include land itself, which would be similar to its treatment in the national accounts. And infrastructure also must be long-lived, capital-intensive, and location-specific. So the word immovable was included in the definition for a time, but then that was removed because infrastructure should include things like buses, trains, and ferries that operate between fixed points, because a ferry operating across a channel serves the same function as a bridge. It would create challenges otherwise with the alignment to regional accounts, where assets must be physically fixed in a fixed area. So hopefully that just gives a flavour that investment, or that defining infrastructure, isn't necessarily straightforward. It is still being developed. Currently, as well, it excludes investment in housing and social housing, for example. So, as I said, this is still being discussed at the OECD level. So, if you have any feedback for us, feed it into us over the summer, and we'll be happy to relay that feedback on. And then to classify infrastructure assets, the emerging way to classify it is under these headings of economic infrastructure, social infrastructure, and also digital infrastructure. So I'll go through these now in this table, and this table we've published this morning in an information note alongside the national accounts. And what it shows is new investment, or the flow into infrastructure of our only of the building and construction element, only in current prices. So you'll see here the economic, or the infrastructure, broken down into those three categories. So under economic infrastructure, we have roads, other transport. Other transport would include sectors like air, sea, and rail investment. We'd hope to, in time, be able to disaggregate those into their component parts. Under energy generation, we have things like power plants, wind, solar farms, and transmission lines. And then we've water supply and sanitation. And if we look at the figures there in current prices in 2024 and 2025, there's been a fall in other transport investment, but a large increase in the energy generation investment. And then under social infrastructure investment, we have education and health investments, and then also a more aggregated category of public buildings, culture, recreation, and other social infrastructure. We'd hope also to be able to disaggregate these public buildings from culture and recreation as well in future work. And then we have digital infrastructure investment. So these would include data centers plus telecoms investment. And what we've seen there is a decline of about 100 million in investment in current prices. And it's just worth restating that this is only the building and construction element of investment. It excludes machinery and equipment, which would also form part of infrastructure. And then this is the second half of the table we've published this morning. It provides, combined with the previous slide, it shows a new breakdown of building and construction in the annual national accounts. So what we see there is about 8 billion of investment that isn't currently classified as infrastructure investment. So we have about 9 to 10 billion of infrastructure investment, and a further 8 billion of non-residential investment. And we've been able to break these down categories for the first time into agriculture and forest development, factory, industry, and other commercial. This would include things like our factories, industrial buildings, and laboratory and research facilities. And then we've been able to break commercial activity, building and construction activity, into office developments, retail, warehouse and storage, and hotels and restaurants, bars and nightclubs. And what we've seen there is a substantial increase in the investment in 2025 into warehouse and storage, and also the hotels and restaurants sector. So the final line there, the total investment in roads and other building and construction, this would sum to table 11.1 in the national accounts, which shows investment in roads plus other building and construction. So where we did have two lines of a breakdown of investment, we've been able to break this down further in this information note. So this is available on the website if you want to take a further look at it. So then, looking into future work that we need to do is we need to do further refinement of these infrastructure classifications, providing more breakdowns where we can. And we need to build a longer time series, both to allow analysis of investment over time, and also that'll help us to develop the existing stock of infrastructure. And then we need to develop deflators to be able to estimate a constant price series and volume changes over time. And coming from that as well would be a depreciation method to be able to calculate the depreciation from the stock of infrastructure assets. So as I said, this is work in progress. Even the definition is evolving at the OECD level. So we really do welcome feedback over the next couple of weeks. Thanks very much.